Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Gavin Heyman and I'm honoured to work for the Open Contracting Partnership. Now, our world runs on public contracts. They make up $1 in every $3 spent by governments. And my organisation works in over 30 countries, really trying to transform the entire contracting process to make contracts more open and more equitable. Now, open, equitable contracts are going to be central to success and sustainability in the green hydrogen sector. We don't need to repeat the mistakes from the fossil fuel industries and the power sectors and elsewhere. We can design in best practices right from the start. This time, it really can be different. And that's why I'm so delighted to have been able to contribute towards this awesome new guide that's been put together by the Green Hydrogen Organization. It's Green Hydrogen Contracting for People and Planet. It's available at the back there. It's also available for online for those of you who are watching on the web. And thank you for joining us too. And really, it's a first step in codifying some of the best practices around how to do this. And it's been a really remarkable collaboration across government, business, civil society, and some of the finest legal minds in the hydrogen sector. And we have those people in the room with us today to really share their contribution, what they've learned from the process, and what's kind of excited them about it, and what the next steps could be. We have a stellar panel to that end. I'm going to sort of introduce them one by one as I ask them questions, and as we explore all the key factors around this. So first of all, if I may, I'm going to turn to Todd Cluett. And Todd, you lead external affairs for Fortescue Future Industries. So I'd love to hear from you, if you'd be so kind, to tell us about why is good practice on this topic so important for project developers? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Yeah, I work for Fortescue Future Industries, and we're sort of amongst the pioneers of trying to develop green hydrogen industry, and we're operating in around 30 different countries. And one of the big challenges for us, and I think everybody who's involved in this on the stage, is this question of how quickly you can go, the question of speed. Now, we are incentivized to move first. We're incentivized to bring down the cost to bring green hydrogen to the market. But in doing so, we need to have put in place contracts between private sector developers, governments, communities that stand the test of time. Now, I'm from a extractive industries background. So I've lived through some of the failures. I've lived through failures to address community concerns. I've lived through failures of contracts that were good at the time of signing, and 5 years in, they've failed. There's a myriad of reasons these things have failed, but there's equally any number of examples of how to do this well, which is why I think this works really, really good. We're under pressure to move this fast. There's good examples through the oil and gas industry and the mining industry of what not to do and how to do it, how to engage communities, how to engage with government, how to insist upon it and get value sharing over the time of the contract. And I think that having that on the table, shared transparently, enables us to move faster. So if you think of our perspective, we're trying to move into a place to make large-scale, multi-billion-dollar investments, capital investments in places where there's no existing hydrogen industry, but we will be there for 30, 40, 50 years. So we've got to have the confidence that the relationship between country and company is sustainable. Now, the contract is the core element of that. So I think the piece of work is critical to enable us to move forward. It gives us confidence, but it gives our counterparties confidence that we're getting it right in an environment where everybody's a bit of a pioneer here, and nobody wants to take a first step and fail. And the consequences of failure here are that we slow the whole process down. And there's sort of commercial consequences for that, but there's broader consequences for the warming of the planet. So I think the works from our perspective Really, really important, and thrilled to be a part of it.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So perhaps I may turn to Hanafi Ahmedou, and Hanafi is Director of Hydrogen for SMH, which is Mauritania's national oil company. Hanafi, I'd love to hear why the guidance will be useful to you as a kind of government actor to really get green hydrogen projects off the ground in the right way.
Thank you, and let me convey my greetings to my colleagues, co-panelists. And yes, we see this guidance at the National Oil Company in Mauritania as very important, because it's true, we are an oil and gas company, but we also starting to convert into the hydrogen business as well. And let me do one analogy here. In the oil and gas business, there is what we call the AIPN, which is Association pour les négociateurs pétrole et gaz. And when you look at this organization, it's a non-profit organization that is preparing contracts model for any kind of transaction. I mean, the CEP contract, which is a production sharing contract, and the GOA contract as well. And yeah, we need to make this analogy with the hydrogen as well. I know it's a bit difficult, but we need to have these model contracts in place. So this contract also needs to reflect the concerns and the pitfalls we have in the oil and gas business, such as the lack of real impact of this project on the host countries. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So we've had a perspective from government, had a perspective from business. Let's turn to civil society. And Maria Christina Munden, you are Senior Project Manager for International Senior Lawyers Projects. I would love to know from your perspective, why good green hydrogen contracting will be important for civil society, and also kind of how do we really maximize the benefits for local communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. So our organization believes in an economic development that is fair and equitable. And how do we achieve this? Now, the two pillars I'll discuss are mentioned in your manual in number 4. And the first is there's a need for transparency by both the government and the private corporations of key information about the projects that are relevant to all the parties concerned. Why is there a need for transparency? Because this builds trust between the communities impacted by the project and all the other stakeholders. And this transparency and accountability ensures that everyone is informed of what's going on. And according to the OECD, multinational enterprises should also be transparent about certain information like beneficial ownership, the project objectives, risk factors, and how the project intends to address risk and the impacts on the community. And the transparency is not just for the private corporations, it should also apply to the government where the project is being implemented. And this pertains to making public contracts transparent, the public procurement process, and also with the government being transparent, there's a higher chance that they also get the support of the public. And second pillar is, and this is very important, is community engagement. And community engagement shouldn't just happen at the start of the project, but throughout the whole life cycle of the project. And this has a twofold effect, actually. First, it minimizes the risk and the negative impacts on the community of the project, but it maximizes the benefits to them as well. And this isn't just ticking off the box that you've met and consulted with the community, it has to be quality information. And I think with free, prior, informed consent, the part on being informed is sometimes misinterpreted. It has to be meaningful stakeholder engagement so that the communities are aware of what their rights are. They can have some sharing in the decision making about, for example, relocation. How can they negotiate for their benefits? Will it provide jobs to the community? And is there room for growth and development? Remember, green energy projects, not just green energy projects, actually, any energy project competes for the same resources as the local communities. So this is important to them. And I actually agree with the speaker from yesterday, I believe Elizabeth Taher, and I'll rephrase what she said. The failure to involve civil society results in the failure of the project itself. That's why being transparent about the whole project and engaging the community throughout the project life cycle is showing them that they matter, and it's showing them that they have a seat on the table. Thank you.
Wonderful. So consult early, consult often, and across the entire chain of the contracting cycle, I heard there. So we've had the perspectives from the three kind of core constituents, as it were. Now we're going to turn it over to the legal brains who've been particularly dealing with the issues, and we'll use the questions to highlight some of the key things around the principles of good hydrogen contracting. Can I, though, turn to you as the audience and maybe ask you all for a show of hands? We've got here the 8 kind of core areas that the guide touches on. I would love people, when I ask, to raise their hands when I say the number, of whether they think that's going to be the stickiest and most difficult of the issues. So first of all, hands up if you think policy and regulatory developments are going to be the stickiest and most difficult issue. Okay, fair. Fair enough. Financing, number 2. Who thinks that's most difficult? Thank you, sir. Okay, great. Number 3, fiscal terms and incentives. Okay, definitely a winner so far. Number 4, community engagement and transparency practices. Okay. Number 5, land acquisition and use. Duly noted. Infrastructure access and common use. Number 6. Okay. Number 7, sustainable development contribution.
0.
Okay, we're confident about that one. That's good to know. And number 8, dispute resolution. Okay, very interesting. So it felt like fiscal terms was perhaps the strongest, and then particularly 5 and 6 were also quite sticky as well. So that's very good. Let's deal into them on the questions. And so if I may, I'll turn to Sybil Ryder, and Sybil is a partner and head of hydrogen at Birds and Birds. And Sybil, you've been in this kind of unique situation of being on both sides, right, of negotiations between key state actors and also on the side of project developers. So what do you think are the key sticking points and some of the challenges that you perceived in actual real negotiations? And then how might the good practice guide help address those?
Yeah, thank you so much, Gavin, for the introduction. And once again, I would like to thank also all the members of the working group, which are not present here. There are so many people having contributed to that green hydrogen contracting guide on a pro bono level. And I think we are all very proud that we are working on that in order to move forward. As it was said, we don't have so much time. We have to move fast, but we have to move in a fair way. And the guide is something to contribute in that fair way. You asked me about what I have seen on the real contractual negotiation. Yeah, I was lucky to advise on a very interesting investment, which is an ongoing development of green hydrogen production in 4 jurisdictions. And there was, like always for investments, due diligence made with respect to the projects. And all of a sudden, it turned out one of the projects was situated in Canada, that there was a First Nations issue. And the developers, from the developers' side, that was perhaps something which was not completely addressed on, and I think it was a very good example because it was a great moment of stress. The whole investment was a little bit in danger because of that, yeah, perhaps missing transparency and process also with respect to those communities. And I think it was a good example to show, yeah, it's important to have that approach, and it's important for all people working on those projects to have that in mind and to follow a process, because if you can't document that correctly, then you might perhaps at a later stage have problems. And another point why this is very important for me to contribute on those practice where you put commitments in place also with respect to communities is I have a long experience on the renewable energy side, and renewable energy projects are sometimes welcomed and sometimes not in my backyard. The people don't want a wind farm close to their houses or something. And what I saw is the only way to really have successful project development is to have that support of the local communities, and to have that not only at the beginning of the project, but all over the project. So what is important also in that guide is to say, okay, set up contracts, try to see how local communities can benefit from projects, but then it's not only a one shot, but it should be like a monitored process. And this kind of monitoring obligation is also something you have in the contracts, and saying, okay, what you promised is really done, and not only for a 1 year period, but perhaps, as you said, we are engaging for 20 years or 30 years, and this should be something which is clearly defined.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I like that sort of thinking in that decadal time horizon and thinking long term, right? And that solid foundation. So thank you for highlighting that. So if I may, I'll turn to Christian Frederick Michelet, and Christian is a partner at Shudot. Christian, you're really thinking about kind of how to join it all together. So I really love you to tell us about the key elements really to link hydrogen policies, the legislation, and the contracts. Share with us how you're thinking about that.
Thank you, Todd, for the introduction. And in our work group, I headed the group working on the issue number 1 here that you can see, policy and regulatory developments. Now, we had the challenge of combining really how to combine policy, regulatory development, and contracts. And I should say that we have a unique historic opportunity now by starting with a new industry where you have this historic possibility to form all this at the same time. I think in the industrial history, this is almost a unique situation. That great opportunity is also challenging because it's so early in the industry that you don't, for example, the market is still uncertain. So that's the challenge we had when we were discussing in our work group. I should also say that behind this one that you got, we have a much larger report. We have really worked, and I think we are still going to develop this further. But coming back, you know, there is a saying that you'll never get a second chance to give a first impression. The same thing applies with regard to contracts in particular. You'll never get a second chance to make the first contract. And the first contract in an industry could make a lot of precedents. Take the oil and gas industry. We're still living with contractual concepts back from Texas in the 1870s. So the first contract is extremely important. Now, what we discussed is how to combine policy, legislation, and contracts. It starts with policy. Second, you need the legislation, and thirdly, you need the contracts. But they need to go together. And in this historic moment, we have the opportunity to combine it all. So the main I would say I'm working also on as legal advisor on a number of hydrogen projects now. And what I experience is a lot of uncertainty. Some parts of the hydrogen value chain is clearly defined and contracts are well known. Power purchase agreements, construction of electrolyzers and plants. But when you come to the shipping part, and in particular to the market, the sales side, there is a lot of uncertainty on how to regulate volume, how to regulate prices. And if the industry and if all the actors here could agree that we need transparency in this work, if instead of everyone making their own contract model, having it confidential to your competitor, you're not going to benefit this great possibility we have to have a harmonized system. So at the end, I would like to say those kind of main principles that we defined, if I just could get on my phone here, the main principles for legislation and policies, we said, 1, clearly defined policy targets. 2, foreseeability in the framework conditions in state support schemes. 3, legislation that provides for efficient administrative processes, typically with regard to concessions. 4, simple legislation adapt to the various stages of the hydrogen value chain. Next, third-party access to monopoly infrastructure, transparent and predictable tariffs. Simplicity in contracts, and contract models that combine the need for adaptation to the developing market conditions and the need for revenue foreseeability in order to make projects bankable. These were the main principles that came out of our work so far.
Wonderful. I'm sure there'll be lots of people in the audience who want to ask more questions. And I really appreciate you again highlighting unique moments to do things differently. So absolutely. Now, if I may, I'll turn to John Patrick Sweeney. He's a partner at Latham & Watkins. Now, JP, you've got the toughest topic here, right? Financing. I think most people put their hands up, say that was one that they thought would be stickiest. It's going to be absolutely key. So what are the kind of key insights from the guidance, right, to really help people get financing right and get green hydrogen projects off the ground?
Thanks, Gavin. I'd like to make maybe a couple of general comments about the guide as it pertains to financing, and then if you have time, maybe touch on a few of the specific content elements. The first general comment is that the guide is focusing on the financing of green hydrogen production projects, but it's fair to say that the principles in the guide pertaining to financing apply more generally across different aspects of the value chain. For example, financing an electrolyzer gigafactory, or financing the renewable power project that will be generating the power needed for the production of the hydrogen. And we heard yesterday from one of the panels that by some estimates, 80% of the funding needs for the green hydrogen sector are going to be eaten up by the renewable power projects themselves. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. The second general comment is that green hydrogen production projects will, of course, come in many shapes and sizes, and the financing terms, of course, will differ. The documentation requirements for the different types of projects will, of course, vary depending on the structure of the projects, whether it's an integrated project or a non-integrated project. If it's a captive project that is, producing green hydrogen for a particular industrial unit that's kind of connected to the facility, whether it's for domestic sales to third parties or export of green hydrogen through green ammonia, or any kind of combination of these aspects. So what we've sought to do in the guide is just take a step back and try to apply general principles that will work for the financing, or have some resonance for the financing of all these different types of structures. In terms of specific items that are covered off in the guide, the financing chapter, the first is financing sources. And again, one of the themes from yesterday, the DFI panel gave a very interesting talk about the need for multi-source, the need for blended financing. I think that was the term that was used. And so the guide looks at the different potential sources of financing, which will be many of the traditional, if not all of the traditional sources of project financing that we've seen come to the fore in other areas of the energy sector. So ECAs, DFIs, commercial banks, as well as going forward, once that initial de-risking has taken place, the institutional investors through the capital markets and other types of kind of energy funds or infrastructure funds will be needed to invest capital to meet the targets. Secondly, risk allocation, which is clearly a key concern, a key theme that's coming up already in the discussion today. How risk allocation is addressed in the financing of these types of projects, both due diligence phase and also through the documentation itself. And finally, the interface, from the other end, the interface of the financing with the regulatory landscape. So I think we find that the financing chapter probably helps kind of bring together some of the threads from the different areas that we've talked about and that we'll come on to talk about today.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So next we'll be turning to Mark Russell, and Mark is a partner and head of hydrogen at Linklaters. And so Mark, again, you've got another one of the sticky topics. So the issue of land use and access to benefits, both our audience sort of highlighted that's one of the issues they think would be really challenging. So, and it's an issue that's come up, I know, more generally between particularly host countries and industry. So what are the recommendations in the guidance and how might they help?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the danger of going seventh is that there's not much that hasn't been said, but let me try and sort of encapsulate it in a way that's relevant to land. And I think one of the key points, again, it's been made, is that there isn't one size that fits all. Whether you're talking about the shape of the project, the different component parts, whether they're aggregated, whether they're separate, or whether you're talking about the legal regime in the jurisdiction that you're dealing with, you've got to approach it on a project by project basis. So that's a starting point. Unfortunately, that means we can't just roll out a list of clauses that you need to stick into every contract. But that said, there are some principles that I think apply wherever you're dealing with land in the context of, well, of any project, but particularly a major energy project. And really, a successful contract, and Todd touched on this earlier, is built on some important pillars. So first of all, you need certainty. So you need to know that your rights are enforceable. To Sybil's point, that you're not going to get some informal land rights, for example, being thrown onto the table when you were least expecting it. So do your diligence. But also certainty of terms, so that you know that you've got an agreement you like and you can live with. It's got to be transparent. It's a key point, and we've touched on that already. I won't dwell on that. It's pretty obvious what it means. It's got to be fair, and I can't emphasize that enough. And again, Todd has touched on this point. If you want to have a contract that you can trust, you can be certain of, coming back to that first limb, you need to make sure that the balance of rights and responsibilities is something that is not just right on day one, but is right on day 10,001. So without any one of those pillars being in place, the whole thing is sort of, well, arguably you can't achieve any one pillar without the other two being in place. It's a bit like the lonely microphone stand in the room next door, sort of rather expensive microphones teetering on top of three little legs. If any one of those legs falls over, it's going to be noisy, it's going to be expensive, and somebody's going to be embarrassed. And actually, that by itself gives rise to a risk of delay in negotiations, right? So the fear factor of getting it wrong is a real one. It has a real impact on project timetable, both in the negotiation phase, the execution phase, and then ultimately the implementation phase. So the guidance, I think, tries to minimize the risk of that delay by putting on the table the perspectives from different stakeholders as to what is, from their perspective, something that's necessary to achieve, because ultimately fairness is all about context and it's all about perspective. If you understand the other side's interests and the interests and requirements of third-party stakeholders, you're a long way down the track in terms of being able to navigate a successful path through that. And that's what we're trying to achieve through the guidance. So taking a few examples, there is a natural tension when you talk about land tenure, for example, between the desire of a project sponsor to know that if he starts investing money or she starts investing money, that ultimately there is a route through to a successful project at the end of the day. On the other hand, host country, the last thing it wants to do is tie up, tens of thousands of kilometers of land potentially with a project that isn't going anywhere. There are learnings out there from the extractive industries, from other industries, as to how you can put milestones in, how you can give certainty to this project sponsors that if they achieve those milestones, they can go through to the next phase. So they're not just having to apply again and potentially risk all of that investment going down the drain. Similarly, when it comes to transfer, we know that like with the extractive industries, a key feature of contracting in the hydrogen space is likely to be joint ventures, sharing risk, bringing expertise from different aspects of the value chain, bringing capital from different sources at different points of the maturity of the project. It's all really important. So having visibility as to how you can make those transfers is important. Having visibility as to what the fiscal implications of making those transfers are going to be is important. Obviously, there's a big overlap between the land arrangements, which I'm assuming in this context will be a bit like a concession, and the fiscal terms. But just providing that certainty and the fairness from the outset, I think, goes a long way to making a basis for investment and a contract that ultimately is deliverable quickly and sustainable on all sides.
Wonderful. And I really struck listening to you, thinking about learning the lessons from the past. I remember the research, I think it was done by Harvard, looking at disputes when they occurred in, I think, mining projects between $3 and $5 billion of capitalization. It cost them about $20 million a day in lost production costs and ancillary costs for getting it wrong. So this does really matter, as people said. So last, but by no means least, we turn to Charles Howland. And Charles is a partner at Curtis, Mallet Provost, Colt and Mosley. And Charles, lots of people are very confident that the sustainable development issue had actually been sort of solved, as it were. Personally, I'm quite worried about that. I don't think it's quite as easy as perhaps, like we're assuming it is. So how exactly can we get this right for green hydrogen? And what are the kind of contracting practices we're going to need to make sure that sustainable development is embedded and it really works for all people in the project?
Gotcha, thank you. It truly is. The only thing worse than being 7th on a panel like this is being 8th on a panel like this. I've had the experiences, maybe some of you have had, that there's 3 or 4 common themes that have been running through each of the panels, and there's generally consensus on them. One of the things that I've found better about today is there's a little bit more sharpness to some of the difficult issues that have to be dealt with. And I think this today's programs generally, and I'm going to try to, with the one thing I think I can do that might be new is try to bring a little bit of a sharp edge that some of this stuff is not as easy as it appears. So, piece that I worked on was the Sustainable Development Goals, right? We hear of them a lot. There's 17 of them. How many of you have actually looked and read them? Okay, most of us sort of have, okay, yeah, let me say how many people have actually read them. So more people are raising their hands than raised their hands earlier as to whether or not SDGs were an issue. So any project, right, any endeavor can typically be looked at through the SDG lens. And there's generally a way with good thought to sort of make any project look good for the SDGs. And that certainly is true for green hydrogen projects. Certainly the one that jumps out, the SDG that jumps out for folks is 13, taking action to address climate change. Right, that's sort of the underlying premise and purpose of green hydrogen projects. I want to draw attention to 4 others that have been discussed under other names that are a little bit different. And I'm going to read them out for those, the majority of the audience at least either hasn't read them or was too modest to raise their hands. 6, ensure the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for everyone. 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable and modern energy. And as an energy lawyer, it's important that we recognize that's not just supply number of kilowatts, but to the extent to which a project can improve the reliability and resilience, especially in a time of increasing stress on electrical infrastructure systems that the already baked into impacts from climate change are going to bring. SDG 8, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth and productive employment and decent work for all. And then 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization. Okay, so there's a little bit of specificity there. So my law firm, which I joined 3 years ago after time at EPA, most of my experience was in the government side and working for communities. Curtis has a long history going back to the early 1800s, representing foreign countries in oil and gas energy matters. That's our sweet spot. The one client that the firm does not take on is international oil companies. That's what you focus on. And I've now picked up on some of the learnings that came from that experience, because there are a lot of parallels, it seems to me, with respect to contracts that can be applied. Anyway, but going back to the SDGs, what's the common theme to those 4 items I just mentioned that's different from number 13, climate change? Each of them is local. Each of them is local to a community and to a region. I heard yesterday, I think it was, maybe it was this morning, discussion on one issue that's very important to SDGs, which is water. The comment was made is, oh, the water issue can be solved. The water balance has existed the same way it has for eons. That's true globally. It is most assuredly not true locally. Green hydrogen projects use a lot of water. We were also told, and this makes sense, that almost any project needs to have some form of desalination, even if it's not pulling seawater. And certainly it is if it is pulling seawater. Where is the brine from that desalination project going to go? 4 days ago in the US, a 10-year-old project had been under development for desalination, not for green hydrogen, just to provide water, was finally killed because of opposition from the community about the impacts of that project. This is Southern California, which is stressed for water. So it's not per se obvious, for example, that desalination is a perfect panacea. So, there's some conflicts here. And we've been told we need to move quickly. We need to move fast. That's true. But here comes the first sort of big repeated point. Early, real community and regional consultation is really important. And one of the things that we're trying to bake into the specifics, the guidance is out there. We still have some work to do. One of the things that we are going to try to bake into, at least as an explicit principle, is the notion of ensuring that actual real consultation happens early on. I've been involved in a number of renewable energy projects where, because these are big projects, we're not talking about distributed generation. These are major industrial projects with huge industrial scale wind, industrial scale solar, hydro, and of course the facility itself. That's a major, major impact on the community. Once you lose community trust, it's typically lost. And I think that's really my big comment, is that it's not just a matter of looking good and being in compliance with these nice principles. This is a matter of, if you lose community trust, the project will be hard to keep on going.
Wonderful. I want to just take a moment of appreciation for the panel being so disciplined on time. Worth clapping, right? Before I turn it over, we've got time, plenty of questions. Just, is there anything any of you heard from the other panelists you particularly wanted to pick up or elevate or respond to immediately? Please, Todd.
It was less from the panelists, Gavin, and more from you. Oh. That you got the impression that this was easy, that people might think this is easy. When I think of developing the green hydrogen industry, one of the things that worries me is that the returns on investment aren't anywhere near as high as they would be in the mining or oil and gas sector. And a lot of these problems up here are solved because you've got really high rates of return. We're not going to have that there. So it's going to be a much, much harder deal to make with the communities to make this stick, particularly, as a number of the panelists have said, the first couple of goes here. Because everybody has, where we operate in a number of the jurisdictions that people come from, there's this expectation that returns are really big. Once you get the project in, it's not going to be the case here.
Fantastic point, thank you. Wonderful, can we turn it over to the audience? You've benefited from the incredible wisdom of our panelists. We'd love to hear from you. We'll take the questions in batches of 3. So hands up, please. You've got unprecedented collection of legal minds and stakeholders who've been working on this. Ask away. Perfect, please do. Yeah, thanks, Ines.
Thank you. I'm Nick from Fortescue Future Industries, but I'm wondering around the fiscal terms and incentives side. Is there an example of a government's fiscal regime that's clear and transparent that we could have a look at that's been done for green hydrogen yet?
Great question. JP, one for you, perhaps.
Fiscal and regulatory side, it's less my. Maybe.
Oh, please, anyone.
Well, I could comment a bit. What I have seen is really different systems, and that's already a challenge. But you take the contracts of difference that are used in several European countries, now in offshore wind, for example, and I think there is a lot of agreement that that could be a good instrument also to use as carbon contracts of difference. However, if I look on the last standard contract of difference in the UK for offshore wind, it's about this thick. And it's got, I think it was between 500 and 600 pages. Now, many legal systems and government is a part of that contract. Many legal systems cannot contract like that. And that could apply also for my own country, for Norwegian government to enter or to enter into that kind of a contractual commitment is not possible. So for the time being, Norway, for example, is working on direct state support, direct subventions. It remains to be seen how this will be developed further. Contracts for difference is a very useful instrument, but if it gets too complicated, and in particular in non-common law systems, I've seen the resistance to go that route in Norway and in other countries. So in other words, no good, clear answer to you.
Yeah, just to echo that.
Sorry,
I just can say in the UK context, obviously we're in the process, I mean, the industry is in the process of trying to negotiate a business model for hydrogen production more broadly, not specifically for green hydrogen. And obviously there's a focus on blue hydrogen in the kind of carbon capture hubs that are being developed in the UK. But it's a protracted and very painful process. And that's with the benefit of a ready-made CFD kind of template from the renewables and nuclear sector. So yeah, just to reiterate that.
And Hanafi, I was going to ask you from the Mauritanian perspective, if you have a particular thought on the regime you're going to devise.
In the Mauritanian case, we are still new in the business of hydrogen. We are in the process of elaborating our hydrogen roadmap, and we are looking at different aspects such as contract structuring, fiscality, incentives. People may be tempted by making the parallel with hydrocarbons contracts, where we have royalties, we have some incomes that the state can make, but the context may differ from one country to another. If some countries are ready to make some incentives to help boost the progress of the hydrogen project, or because they are under pressure to meet the net zero emission goals, other countries may not be in the same logic, because like Mauritania, for example, we have right now, we are at 40% renewable of our mix. We have a very low footprint in the pollution. So we are looking to find the sweet spot that will help the country draw the foreign investments and also make some benefits to the country. So again, another non-clear answer to this question, because I think everyone is looking now for benchmarks, and there's not a big number of benchmarks for the hydrogen contracting. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. We have Jonas, guest appearance, like a green hydrogen. Jonas, over to you. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Why not the 9th or 10th gray-haired man on the panel? Look, guys, I just need to run to one other thing, but I just want to really thank you all, because, and you sit here so politely and say these things, but it is, as Christian Fredrik says, this is super important. We have a really important opportunity to get it right. And I think, so listening to you, it is so obvious, so many in this room have many bad experiences from the oil and gas industry, reminding us of the risks, reminding us of the importance of getting it right this time. And the risks are in some ways even worse, because it has to happen so quickly. It is, the revenues, as Todd said, are not going to be that great. Many of the companies are quite young and inexperienced in what they're doing, and many of the governments are quite inexperienced. I think that we have made a really good start, and we are grateful. But let's also be clear, we have barely scratched the surface in terms of what we can do together. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Jonas. Now, any more questions? Please, sir. Yep. Oh, there's a microphone just coming away.
I'm John Bush from the International Lawyers Project. I'm curious as to the source of law you'd use in these contracts. Is it English law? Is it New York law? Does it matter dramatically whether it's civil law or common law? I'm kind of curious what the background is in formulating these contracts.
Please, maybe Sybil.
Well, actually, that kind of law is depending on the situation of the project, on the stakeholders, what choice of law. I mean, if you're asking for contracts for difference, they are in the law of the country who is granting that equivalent of revenue. Same for state support, which is then generally a contract submitted to the law of the states. And if it's just private contracts chosen, it is generally depending on the developers or the stakeholders of the project and the situation perhaps where the country where the project is. So it's a variety of laws applicable. There's not one particular which is predominant, but for the moment being really depending on different factors, as I said.
Maybe I could add something from an international kind of project finance perspective. You're down to two choices, generally English law and New York law, in terms of the legal systems that the international lending community as a whole are comfortable with because of precedent. Either they've someone signed off on it before internally, so they assume it's okay, or they've been through a process, an enforcement process before under that system. So, and I think in the international energy space, there were dominated as well by US international oil companies that had a preference for New York law, maybe. I'd be interested in others' perspectives, but we're seeing increasingly kind of English law, which was always popular, being kind of more default. So less New York law kind of international project financings today than was the case maybe like 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. I guess if I'd understood the question maybe as when we're coming up with our draft contracts or our draft clauses, what are we using as the reference point for drafting style and so forth? And frankly, we're not at that point. So you won't see, at least in the content that I've been looking at, draft wording, partly for exactly the reason that you talk about. Some contracts, as Sybil said, will need to be local law contracts. That will be the expectation of host countries. In the case of land, that may be a legal requirement. So we're clearly not going to be prescriptive as to what host countries ought to draft and how they ought to draft. But also, I just think in terms of the maturity of the market, we're not, I personally don't feel like we're at the point where we can, as an organization, be pushing out drafting to say this is the standard that everybody ought to be living to. And I know that I'm also part of the Association of International Energy Negotiators, as it's now called, previously petroleum negotiators. And we had exactly this debate in the context of hydrogen. You know, are we at a point where we can or should be, as a as an industry of energy lawyers, let's say, in a place where we can start propose template contracts for people to roll out, and it might be possible in some cases for smaller projects, domestic projects, where there's high volume of projects, high volume of transactions in a particular area. But for the kind of big cross-border green ammonia, green hydrogen export projects we're talking about, I think that's some way off personally.
Perfect. We have time for one last question. Is there? Oh, ma'am, please.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sam from FFI Communities team. I wanted to ask for reflections from anyone on the panel about community benefits and how they can be written into contracts. What any specific thoughts you had? I see in the guide, community development agreements is in there, which is pretty common in mining, usually percentage of revenue tied. So, with levels of revenue being as they are and profits, then that's a lot easier to write in and perhaps more stable than what we're going to see here. The other one I note is SDG 7 around the supply of excess renewable energy, which something some of the engineers have been telling me is not that easy to do with large scale green hydrogen projects. So I'd just be really interested in reflections on some examples of what could successfully be written into contracts around community benefits.
Perfect. That sounds like a question for Maria on community benefits, so that's all right, and community engagement, and then Charles on SDG.
Anyone can feel free to add to this as well. For community benefits, you have to include basically socioeconomic benefits. If there's employment for the communities, for the local communities, if there's resettlement, resettlement bans, compensation. For example, a lot of the land that's used for these projects were being used by as agricultural land by the communities. So you have to make sure there's sufficient compensation for that. But I do have to point out that sometimes the terms and conditions in community engagements are sufficient and feasible, but it's another matter when you're talking about implementation and enforcement. So that's also something you have to ensure. And of course, feel free to add to any of the benefits.
Thank you. I think this is a crucial question because I always come back to the oil and gas experience with so many countries, namely in Africa, where mega oil and gas projects were developed, and there's a very low impact on the, social impact is very low in terms of employment, in terms of value creation at the local level, and so on. So at the government level, we want to avoid those pitfalls and build on those failures to structure the new contracting frame to take care of those aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I want to make 2 points. In part, answering the question that came before, what should the contracts look like? Again, all my points are obvious ones, but I'm going to make this one. This is not one contract. These are a series of contracts, and they're going to look very different depending on what the sort of business model is for the country. Okay, so I've talked with people at this conference where they're interested purely in building projects for export. And that's their main focus. Employment would be nice, but that's their focus, is on export. Other countries see this as a broader infrastructure development sort of exercise. So the contracts will look different. Some of those contracts are more familiar to the folks, to some, than other pieces of it. And I guess the second piece, I really want to echo what Maria said. So as an old environmental enforcement attorney, enforcement. How many contracts have been written with some great aspirational goals in them, but there is no mechanism set up for ongoing regular review and enforcement. So I think, as we go forward for some of this work, trying to be sure that we bake into whatever model provisions we do come up with just ways that we all can agree with would make sense for ongoing enforcement, it's a reassessment.
Great, and I'd highlight number 8 there, the importance of dispute resolution, hopefully before it even gets to enforcement. So how do you have that dialogue with people to resolve problems? So we're at our time. I'm going to go and ask each of you just for one closing, either observation or how do we get this right? So we are at a historic moment of rethinking things. We can make it different. So what's the one next step you recommend or one key insight from this event? And we'll start with Charles and we'll go all the way back to Todd.
Again, a repeat, early real engagement with the regional and local community. Don't put that off until the end.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reason I said I thought it was too early to come out with draft provisions is because the last thing we want to do is, as an industry, is go into a dark room, try and create the perfect solution and roll it out, only to find that it's not the right one. So I think, to your point, Charles, we need to have that dialogue. We need to have the dialogue with the people who've got the perspectives that matter and get all that input. And so a bit of a plea, I guess, on behalf of the panel, when we do roll out the guidance and invite consultation, the more responses we get, the more valuable the exercise will be at the end of the day for everybody.
Yeah, just to echo that point, for the success of the guide and these contracting principles, it's all about the buy-in. So we've sat in our kind of offices drafting provisions and having Zoom calls and whatever, but we really need buy-in from the wider community. And it's going to take ongoing engagement by the advisors and the participants, both government and private sector, to think creatively about how to adapt, existing principles to this new sector.
Right, so I'll follow up on my introductory part, that we have this unique possibility to a global harmonized legal system, both on policies, legislation, and contracts. And in order to grab that and get that harmonization, my recommendation is transparency, and particular transparency on the industrial actors, the producers of green hydrogen and the buyers. If they can be transparent, except for really confidential competitive issues, we can obtain a harmonized contract platform. So transparency is my recommendation.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I would have chosen the same transparency. And perhaps I could add something like sharing also. I mean, this is what we try to do on the level of this guide, sharing experience and sharing insights and trying to put into place something which is for the benefit actually of all of us. So this is just something I would like to see in the market, that yeah, we try to be transparent. We're not promising anything we can't keep, and we try to share the good experiences in order to move forward on a fair basis.
This is the disadvantage of being third to the last. They pretty much said everything already. So again, we have to learn from our past mistakes. We can get 1 to 8 right, but if we fail to get number 4 right, which is transparency and community engagement, the project will fail. So we have to ensure it's sustainable and successful by involving civil society and the communities.
Thank you. I think I would just say it's important to have the governments that will be hosting of the countries that will be hosting this hydrogen project have their say on this contract and address their concerns with regard to that matter. Thank you.
Lucky last. Thanks for that. Mine's a little different. I think the key thing is just to get on with it. It's really easy to be scared by the risks that we've all spoken about, the fear of being the first mover, but we've got the experience, you've got the skill set, the governments, the private sector, the civil society, the legal profession. My take, lean in, get it done. We can do it.
Awesome. On that, just getting on with it. Ines, would you like to say just a couple of words about the next steps for the working group and the guidance?
Just very quickly, the guidance that you have in front of you is just a little sneak peek of what's available online for each of these topics. As I think I really agree with what Mark was saying, that this is a starting point. We're trying to draw lessons as we go along. And want to help make sure that we move quickly, as Todd is asking, in a way that's responsible. So we do really hope that you go on a website, look at some of the guidance, and let us know if you have any comments. Let us know if you want to be involved going forward. We hope to build on this, expand the guidance, keep including good practice examples, and also organize webinars, capacity building activities together with partners. Thanks to John, we already have some thinking around fiscal terms and incentives in Africa. So reach out to us if you're interested in knowing how to get involved in the project.
So there you go, reach out, get involved. And with that, thank you all very much. Been a wonderful audience. And thank you to our amazing panel who kept the time as well. So thank you all.